I want to begin with I was putting together this month's Inner Sanctum newsletter, and it's all about the Antarctic. And you've been on with me before. We've talked about some of the mysteries of the Antarctic, but I want to begin with the Admiral Byrd, the secret diary, and purportedly that he flew his plane over this. While he was flying over the Antarctic, all of a sudden he saw this verdant, beautiful green area with wildlife and so forth, and basically had flown into the inner Earth, an opening in the inner Earth. What do you make of the Byrd diary?
I have read the whole thing, and I quote from it extensively. It's quite a fascinating account because he, absolute historic fact, was the first aviator to fly over the South Pole. He discovered it by air a few decades after Amundsen, the Norwegian, and the Scott party 35 days later reached it by land. So he flew over it. And if there is a giant hole under the ice, he would have seen it on that flight in the 1920s. Well, the diary is dated, time-stamped and dated in 1946, the famous year of Operation High Jump. And historically, he was definitely the head of that fleet. But the interesting thing about that diary, Richard, is he says it's the Arctic. Now, is that a typo, or is that a way to throw people off? Or does he always mean the Antarctic? But it was definitely published after his death. And this was according to his son, who was given the diary and asked to publish it posthumously, which he did. The son did, and kept it as is. So it said that they were flying the Arctic. It was the dates right around the end of 1946 when he was definitely in Antarctica for Operation High Jump. And it's also a known historic fact that he did fly to the South Pole again from Little America, the base that he helped set up. And there were 3 hours of missing time on his flight that day that they recorded in Little America. And he only went with his radio man. And according to the diary, they go into this verdant green valley, as you describe. And one of the first things they see, they misidentified as an elephant. Later on, they flew closer and saw it was a woolly mammoth, an extinct mega fauna and mega flora on the ground there. Well, as we've talked about previously in our interviews on Antarctica, it is the most volcanically active continent. So there are geothermal features that could melt great big domes under the ice. It's quite foreseeable that he could have flown into one of these. Now, could there be life down there, including woolly mammoths? That seems like a far stretch. But the story goes on, and then shortly after they see the woolly mammoth, they lose control of the plane and also lose contact with the base. So they're wondering what's going on, but the plane is still flying and the instruments are still under remote control. All of a sudden, 2 UFOs come wingtip to wingtip. Admiral Byrd describes them as flugel rods, these flying discs. And then all of a sudden on the speaker comes a Germanic voice that says, "You are in good hands, Admiral. We will be landing in the domain shortly. Just relax." And they touch down, but first they see this magnificent city. Best way I could describe it, the way he writes about it in the diary, it's kind of like the Emerald City from The Wizard of Oz. And they land in the domain of the Ariani. And Admiral Byrd wrote that on the Flugelrad were insignias of Nazi Germany. And when the pilots came out, they're tall, blonde guys with Germanic accents. And they said, "You have been summoned to meet with the master." The radio man stayed behind, and so did the other pilots. And Admiral Byrd had an audience with the master, who warned him on the dangers of nuclear war. Because this is 1946, it's only a year after Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And they were saying, "You're a very well admired admiral. We'd like you to go back to the Pentagon and tell your superiors not to play around with these weapons and to disarm what you have and put an end to this madness. Well, we know in history that didn't happen. Mm-hmm. But Admiral Byrd flew out of there the same way he came. And the last thing he heard from the pilots when they regained his ability to fly was Auf Wiedersehen, said goodbye in German to him. And then back to little America they went. But what's interesting, Richard, from the diary is those dates are right when they get down to Antarctica with the Operation High Jump. And Admiral Byrd, being a military man as he was, had to follow his orders. His orders were to go to the New Schwabenland base and confront the Germans on the surface area there, which they did. But it was a very one-sided battle, and these Flugelrods came up out of the water and could have easily taken out the whole armada of ships, but just in a show of force took out all the planes and sank one of the ships. And that made Admiral Byrd leave Antarctica 2 months into 6-month expedition called Operation High Jump.
And officially, Operation High Jump was like a scientific expedition, but right. The actual purpose was to invade this Nazi base that the Germans had established in the Antarctic in New Schwabenland, as early as the 1930s?
Well, that's when they went down there in the late 1930s under the direction of Hermann Göring, who was the head of the Luftwaffe, the air command of Germany, before the war began. And they flew around this area and dropped these 2-meter long, not bombs, but they kind of flew down like bombs with an insignia to demark their land claim, which was already claimed by the Norwegians and known as Queen Maud Land. It's basically the portion of Antarctica directly south from South Africa, which, by the way, during World War II, they were sympathetic to the Nazis and were allowing them to refuel and resupply before the U-boats and other ships were heading down to the land claim in New Schwabenland. Well, Richard, I'm looking at maps 5 and 6 years ago before my trip down there, and I'm finding Cold War era maps of Antarctica from the early 1980s. And I was surprised to see that the Germans never left New Schwabenland. In fact, they're still there to this day. They have several bases in that same land claim of Antarctica.
The rumors of Hitler surviving the Fuhrer bunker, and I mean, I don't think there's much doubt now that that was not his body that was taken by the Soviets. I think even the Soviets confirmed the DNA; it was a female. But the legend that he was spirited out of Berlin, taken on a submarine down to a base in New Schwabenland, and then from there perhaps on to Argentina. Any evidence that you've come across to suggest that he was taken there and then on to Argentina?
Yeah, quite a bit of evidence, Richard. First of all, there are documents in the FBI archive stating that he would be most likely found at certain locations in Argentina or Colombia or Chile. A lot of those countries were sympathetic to the Nazi cause, and many of them were propped up with fascist governments like Pinochet in Chile. And around the time of World War II, Perón government in Argentina was very sympathetic. So I went to this town near Cordoba, Argentina, Cordoba being the second largest city outside of Buenos Aires. And it was an industrial hub. It could have really taken off and been the economic powerhouse, but there was so much corruption in government, kind of like Ferdinand Marcos government in the Philippines. They just siphoned so much money for themselves. They didn't use it for infrastructure development. But there's a little town above Cordoba called La Falda. And I went there, and there is a place called the Eden Hotel that Hitler visited pre-war, and they were sympathetic to the cause. When I rolled in there, Richard, it was like going to a little Bavarian town in Germany. There are signs where you could get Wiener Schnitzel for lunch or strudel for dessert, and all the architecture looked like Germany. So I went and did the tour of the Eden Hotel. And fortunately, the tour guide, he could speak English quite well because my Spanish is not very good. And at the end of the tour, I said, do you really think that Hitler survived and actually came here? He goes, oh, I don't have to think. I know. I said, well, how do you know? He said, just right here in town, there's an elderly woman who was the chambermaid in the Eden Hotel when she was a teenager. And she has gone on record and even taken a lie detector test that she saw Adolf Hitler, Eva Braun, his wife, and even their German Shepherd dog, Blondie, survived and came to the Eden Hotel. And what they did to keep him alive and move him around was they set up all these safe houses everywhere. So that's a tidbit of evidence, but also in Bariloche, where we did coast to coast, I went and looked as close as I could get to the Inalco house, which is right on the lake there. And there was a great History Channel series called Hunting Hitler. And while I couldn't get close enough to see the house, I could see the bay where it was on. They went in on the water and went ashore, and they found the seaplane garage. So if the authorities were moving in on him at the Inalco house, they could just quickly shepherd him into the seaplane and then fly over the crest of the Andes Mountains right into fascist Chile. So they always had a way to escape. But I think they brokered a deal with the U.S. after the 1952 flyover in Washington, D.C., when it was the Antarctica Nazis flying their Flugorods in a show of force saying, look, we can fly over your most sensitive airspace and you can't do anything about it. So Truman panicked. He was still the president in his last few months and wrote basically surrender treaty with the Antarctic Nazis. And Laura Eisenhower, in her new book, Awakening the Truth Frequency, has whistleblower testimony and also information from her own family that said her great-grandfather, Dwight D. Eisenhower, when he became president a couple months later, he was handed a raw deal. He was not happy about that. You mean he was the supreme commander in Europe? He fought the Nazis and saw so much carnage, and now the previous president surrendered to them? So this kind of set off in motion this whole idea that there was a third force the whole time, this Fourth Reich set up in South America and operating more of as an intelligence agency, but still holding quite a bit of power and money. So Martin Bormann, the money man, he kept popping up all over South America in the 1950s. At the end of the war, he was the number 2 to Adolf Hitler. So it's very conceivable that many of the top Nazis, including Hitler himself, survived World War II, faked their own death, had doppelgangers if they needed them, so they could escape to South America. And I wouldn't be surprised if they even made a trip down to Base 211 in Antarctica.